March 1945, Fort Devens, Massachusetts. The handkerchief came away crimson again. Major Otto Reinhardt stood in the processing line, swaying slightly, watching American soldiers move past him with the efficient detachment of men cataloging inventory. Each cough brought copper taste flooding his mouth. Each breath rattled through lungs that felt like broken glass grinding against his ribs. The tuberculosis had been his invisible companion since El Alamein, 3 years of desert heat and French winters, 3 years of pretending the fever was exhaustion and the blood was nothing serious. Now, standing in enemy custody on foreign soil, pretending had become impossible. He folded the handkerchief carefully, hiding the stain inside. Around him 200 German prisoners shuffled forward in wool uniforms that hung loose on frames hollowed by retreat and capture. The war had ended for them 5 days earlier near the Rhine, where American tanks had rolled through their defensive positions like farm equipment through wheat. Reinhardt remembered the moment of surrender with crystalline clarity. Not the shame propaganda had promised, but overwhelming relief. The fighting had stopped. He would not have to order boys half his age to die for positions that meant nothing anymore. But standing in this processing center, listening to his lungs struggle for each breath, Reinhardt understood with absolute certainty that surrender had merely changed the manner of his death. The tuberculosis would finish what Allied artillery had started. Perhaps weeks remained, perhaps only days. German field hospitals had offered nothing except morphine and isolation. He expected even less from American captivity. An orderly called his name, mangled pronunciation, but recognizable. Reinhardt stepped forward into a small examination room where a young captain with wire-rimmed glasses waited beside a portable X-ray machine. "Remove your shirt, Major." The English words came slowly to Reinhardt's fever-clouded mind. He unbuttoned his tunic with fingers that trembled. Whether from weakness or cold, he could not say. The captain positioned him against the X-ray plate, stepped behind a lead screen, and captured an image of the battlefield inside Reinhardt's chest. 15 minutes later, the captain returned with photographs that looked like storm clouds photographed from above. He pointed to white patches spreading across both lung fields like frost crystallizing on winter windows. Tuberculosis. Advanced. Reinhardt nodded. He had known since North Africa, had felt the disease colonizing his body with patient determination. The captain made notes on a clipboard, his pen scratching across paper with bureaucratic precision. "You'll be quarantined immediately. TB is highly contagious. Can't risk the other prisoners." Isolation, then. Reinhardt had expected this. What he had not expected was the captain's next statement, delivered in the same neutral tone one might use to discuss weather or train schedules. "We'll begin treatment tomorrow." Reinhardt stared at him. Treatment. Streptomycin, new antibiotic. Works against tuberculosis. The words made no sense. Reinhardt's German, learned in university before the war, consumed everything, included extensive medical vocabulary. He had studied engineering but maintained broad intellectual interests, yet this word was unfamiliar. More confusing than the terminology was the implicit promise Americans would treat an enemy officer for a disease that required months of expensive intervention. "I don't understand. Why would you waste medicine on prisoners?" The captain looked up from his notes, his expression neither friendly nor hostile. "Because you're sick. That's reason enough." Reinhardt spent that first night in a small isolation ward, a converted storage room with a single bed, a chair, and a window overlooking snow-covered fields. He lay awake listening to footsteps pass in the corridor outside, trying to make sense of what the captain had told him. Treatment. For an enemy. With experimental medicine. German propaganda had prepared him for many things in American captivity. Labor camps, starvation rations, perhaps casual brutality from guards whose friends had died on European battlefields. No one had mentioned medical care that exceeded what German soldiers received in their own hospitals. The fever climbed through the night. Reinhardt drifted between waking and sleep, his mind conjuring memories with hallucinogenic vividness. El Alamein again, The British bombardment that had lasted 7 days, transforming the desert into a moonscape of craters and burning vehicles. He remembered crouching at a foxhole while shells screamed overhead, remembered the moment when concussive force had thrown him against the wall and he'd coughed for the first time into a handkerchief that came away spotted with red. A dust infection, he'd told himself. It would pass. But it had not passed. Through the long retreat across Libya, through the evacuation to Sicily, through the Italian campaign, and finally the defense of the fatherland itself, the disease had metastasized in his lungs like a second enemy, patient, invisible, inexorable. By late 1944, every breath hurt. By early 1945, he could no longer deny what was happening inside his chest. Dawn light through the window woke him. A nurse entered, middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair, and the efficient movements of someone who had handled thousands of patients. She took his temperature, checked his pulse, made notes on a chart that hung from the foot of his bed. Doctor will be in shortly. The doctor arrived 30 minutes later. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, tall man in his mid-40s, with the weathered face of someone who had practiced medicine in difficult places. He pulled the chair close to Reinhardt's bed and sat down, reviewing the X-rays with the focused attention of a chess master studying a particularly complex position. "Your tuberculosis is extensive," Hayes said in German that carried a slight Bavarian accent. "Both lungs are affected. Without treatment, you have perhaps 2 months, maybe less." Reinhardt appreciated the directness. German doctors had offered vague reassurances and knowing looks. Hayes offered facts. "The streptomycin is experimental," Hayes continued. "We've been testing it for 18 months with promising results. It requires daily injections for at least a year, possibly longer. The treatment is expensive and the supply is extremely limited. Most American soldiers don't have access to it yet." Reinhardt struggled to sit up, his lungs protesting the movement. Then, "Why give it to me?" Hayes set down the X-rays and looked at Reinhardt with eyes that had seen too much suffering to maintain comfortable delusions. "Because medical ethics don't end at national borders. You're sick. I can help. That's the entire equation. I was your enemy. I fought against American soldiers. I probably killed men you knew." "Probably," Hayes agreed. "And now you're my patient. That's how medicine works. We treat the person in front of us, not the uniform they wore or the flag they served." The nurse returned with a tray containing a syringe filled with clear liquid. Streptomycin, the miracle drug that American factories were producing in quantities too small to meet even military demand. Hayes prepared the injection with practiced efficiency, swabbing Reinhardt's arm with alcohol that smelled sharp and medicinal. "This will hurt. The injections always do. You'll receive them daily for the foreseeable future." The needle entered Reinhardt's muscle. Pain flared, not unbearable but persistent, a burning ache that radiated from the injection site. Hayes withdrew the needle and applied pressure with a cotton swab. "Rest now. The fever will break in a few days. The coughing will decrease gradually. It won't be comfortable, but if the treatment works, you'll live." Hayes left. Reinhardt lay in the narrow bed, feeling the streptomycin entering his bloodstream, beginning its microscopic warfare against the bacteria colonizing his lungs. Through the window, he could see other German prisoners moving across the camp, men assigned to work details, to kitchen duty, to whatever labor the Americans required. They would spend their captivity in barracks, working and waiting for repatriation. Reinhardt would spend his captivity in this small room, fighting a different war. The days acquired a rhythm measured in injections and small improvements. Each morning at 700 hours, the nurse arrived with the syringe. Each evening, Hayes stopped by to review progress, to adjust dosages, to explain what was happening inside Reinhardt's body as the antibiotics systematically destroyed the tuberculosis bacteria. "Think of it as a siege," Hayes said during one of these visits. "The bacteria have fortified positions in your lungs. Streptomycin attacks their walls, disrupts their supply lines, eventually starves them out. But it takes time. Months, not weeks. Reinhardt's military training made the metaphor comprehensible. He had conducted sieges, had supervised the slow reduction of defensive positions through artillery and attrition. Now he was both the battlefield and the prize being fought over. The fever broke after 6 days. The constant coughing that had marked his last year gradually diminished. Blood stopped appearing in his handkerchiefs, first occasionally, then consistently. By the end of the second week, Reinhardt could breathe deeply without pain fracturing through his chest. Hayes showed him new X-rays after 30 days of treatment. The white patches in his lungs had receded slightly, edges becoming less defined as scar tissue replaced active infection. "It's working," Hayes said with quiet satisfaction. "Your body is winning." Through the window, Reinhardt watched seasons change with the slow inevitability of continental drift. Spring arrived, snow melting into mud, bare trees producing green buds that swelled into leaves. Summer followed with heat that reminded him of North Africa, though Massachusetts humidity bore no resemblance to desert aridity. Autumn painted the trees in colors that German forests never achieved, violent reds and impossible oranges. Other German prisoners rotated through work assignments, earned small wages, waited for news of repatriation. Reinhardt remained in his isolation ward, receiving daily injections that gradually transformed his prognosis from terminal to recoverable. Hayes visited 3 times weekly, usually in late afternoon when his rounds were complete. They spoke in German, Hayes's fluency explaining itself during one conversation when he mentioned studying medicine in Munich before the war. Sometimes they discussed treatment protocols and medical theory. More often they talked about everything except medicine, books they had read, music they had loved, the incomprehensible sequence of decisions that had led Europe to self-destruction. "Why did you become a doctor?" Reinhardt asked during one of these conversations. Hayes considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all inquiries. "Because I watched my father die from pneumonia when I was 17. The doctor said there was nothing to be done. This was before antibiotics. He died over 3 days, drowning in his own lungs while I sat beside his bed, feeling completely helpless. I decided then that if I couldn't save everyone, I would at least try to save someone. And now you're saving your enemies." "I'm saving sick people," Hayes corrected. "The enemy part is temporary. The sick part is what matters." Reinhardt understood this was not naive idealism, but hard-won philosophy forged through years of practicing medicine in a world determined to create casualties faster than doctors could treat them. Hayes had served in field hospitals through North Africa and France, had performed surgery under bombardment, had made impossible triage decisions when resources fell short of need. He had earned his principles through exhaustion and moral compromise. "What happens when I'm cured?" Reinhardt asked. "You go home. Germany needs doctors more than it needs prisoners." Home. The word carried weight and absence. Reinhardt had received 3 letters from his wife since capture, carefully censored communications that revealed more through omission than statement. Hamburg had been bombed repeatedly. Food was scarce. The hospital where she worked as a nurse had lost most of its staff to conscription or flight. Reading between the lines of her careful prose, Reinhardt understood Germany was not merely defeated, but devastated. By November 1945, Reinhardt's X-rays showed dramatic improvement. The white patches had receded to small shadows. His breathing had normalized. The fever that had stalked him for 3 years had vanished completely. Hayes reviewed the latest radiographs with the satisfaction of an artist completing a difficult commission. Remarkable recovery. The tuberculosis is effectively arrested. You'll need to continue treatment for another 6 months to prevent relapse. But the danger has passed. Reinhardt looked at the X-rays, seeing lungs that now resembled healthy organs rather than bacterial colonies. "You saved my life with medicine most American soldiers don't have access to yet." Why? They had discussed this question before, but Reinhardt kept returning to it, unable to fully reconcile the reality of his treatment with his understanding of how nations treated captured enemies. Hayes put down the X-rays and met Reinhardt's gaze directly. Because I took an oath to do no harm and to treat the sick to the best of my ability. That oath doesn't include exceptions for nationality or wartime status. Every patient deserves treatment regardless of which uniform they wore or which flag they saluted. Your government could have let me die. It would have been easier, cheaper, certainly more popular with American soldiers who lost friends to German artillery. Easier isn't the same as right, Hayes said. Medicine has to mean something beyond expedience. If we only treat people we like or approve of, we're not practicing medicine. We're practicing politics with a stethoscope. The conversation stayed with Reinhardt through the winter of 1945 into 1946. He continued receiving daily injections, watching the Massachusetts landscape cycle through seasons while his body completed its reconstruction. By spring, Hayes declared him fully recovered, a medical miracle that would have been impossible anywhere else in the world. Repatriation came in May 1946. Reinhardt boarded a transport ship with 200 other German prisoners, all returning to a country that existed primarily as administrative zones managed by occupying powers. During the Atlantic crossing, he stood on deck watching waves roll past, thinking about the 18 months he had spent in that small isolation ward, while streptomycin performed its bacterial warfare inside his chest. The Hamburg he returned to bore no resemblance to the city he had left. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Displaced persons camped in ruined buildings. Former soldiers with missing limbs begged on street corners. The hospital where his wife worked operated from a partially destroyed building with equipment scrounged from military surplus and black market trades. She met him at the train station, thinner than he remembered, older than the years justified, but alive. They embraced without words, understanding that language could not bridge the distance their separate wars had created. "You look healthy," she said finally. "I expected—" "I was dying," Reinhardt interrupted. "The Americans saved me with medicine most of their own soldiers couldn't get. They treated me for 18 months while I was their prisoner." She absorbed this information with the stunned expression of someone confronting reality that contradicted everything propaganda had promised. But why? Because I was sick and they could help. Apparently that's reason enough. Reinhardt enrolled in medical school using the observational education he had received during his captivity. University regulations were flexible for returning veterans, especially those with relevant experience. He studied with desperate intensity, driven by understanding that Germany's collapsed healthcare system needed doctors more urgently than it needed engineers. His practice opened in Hamburg in 1949, focusing exclusively on former prisoners of war struggling with physical and psychological trauma. The office occupied 2 rooms in a building that still showed shrapnel scars. Equipment came from military surplus, donations, and creative improvisation. Reinhardt treated thousands of veterans over the following decades, men suffering from tuberculosis, dysentery, malnutrition, untreated wounds, and the invisible injuries that no X-ray could capture. He never charged patients who could not pay. Most could not. Reinhardt worked 18-hour days, 6 days weekly, treating the human wreckage of a war that had consumed an entire generation. Colleagues asked why he pushed himself so relentlessly when other doctors maintained comfortable practices treating affluent patients. Reinhardt would explain about Fort Devens, about Hayes, about receiving experimental treatment when death seemed certain, about learning that medicine could transcend warfare, that healing had no nationality, that humanity persisted even when nations tried to destroy it. "I can never repay what Hayes gave me," he would say. "I can only pass it forward to others who suffered." The correspondence between Hayes and Reinhardt began in 1947 and continued for 3 decades. Letters crossed the Atlantic describing medical advances, family news, shared memories of that experimental tuberculosis ward. Hayes never sought recognition for his decision to treat enemy officers with scarce medication. It simply aligned with his Hippocratic oath. Reinhardt's letters often included case studies, seeking Hayes's advice on particularly difficult patients. In 1978, dying from pancreatic cancer that no miracle drug could cure, Reinhardt wrote his final letter. His hand shook, making the German script difficult to read, but the message was clear. You taught me that medicine transcends warfare, that healing has no nationality, that humanity persists even when nations try to destroy it. I have spent 30 years trying to honor that lesson. When I see former prisoners walking out of my office with treatable conditions finally addressed, I think of you standing beside my bed at Fort Devens, explaining that medical ethics don't end at national borders. You saved more than my life. You saved my understanding of what it means to be human. Thank you. Hayes received the letter 3 weeks after Reinhardt's death. He kept it in his desk drawer, pulling it out occasionally when younger doctors asked why he had wasted precious resources on enemy prisoners during the war. His answer never changed. Because they were sick. That's reason enough.